It's an enormous pleasure for me to welcome our guests tonight. We're not always so privileged as to have an opposition leader from a foreign state join us. Dr. Zamora is well known to all of you. I will not repeat his lengthy resume to you, but as you all know, he's been very active in El Salvador's politics since at least 1970. He's been a member of the Christian Democratic Party and then left that party when he felt it no longer was the appropriate vehicle. After the assassination of his brother in 1980 by a death squad, he fled the country. He has taught at several of the universities of the area, Central America, as well as at Essex in Great Britain. He joins us from an academic background, a serious student of political affairs, as well as being a profoundly committed activist in El Salvador. Many people believe that he is the charismatic leader of the opposition movement. His career has been marked by strong opposition, but also major efforts to reconcile. And in that spirit, it gives me a great deal of pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Ruben Zamora.
Thank you very much for your kind presentation, and thank you to the Board of the Council of Foreign Relations of Baltimore and all of you for being here to talk a little bit about this situation in El Salvador and what is so important, I think, for us in El Salvador, and I hope for you as well, the perspective of peace in our country. El Salvador, as you know, is a tiny country, more or less the size of the state of Massachusetts, 5 million people. Right now, 4 living inside the country and 1 million living outside the country. That has been going on for a process of war, for a situation of war for the last 8 years. It has been and is still a terrible war in El Salvador going on. Has cost us, in terms of development, for instance, more than 20 years now. Because if the war stops now, the country will regain his national product and per capita income and so on that we have before the beginning of the war in 20 years. That means those 8 years mean for us 20 years retrocess in economic terms. More than 60,000 people have been killed in El Salvador in the last 8 years. And that means quite a few 100,000 if you take the proportion between the population of the United States and the population of El Salvador. And still are being killed. We have, as I said before, 20% of our population that is either refugees, that mean living outside the country, or displaced persons, as they are called. That means they have been pushed from their normal areas of living and now are living surrounding the towns as marginal people, the displaced person. 1/4 of our population is now in that situation. And this war tends to go on and on. And there, I think that it's important for us to understand why this war is going on in El Salvador and why this war is prolonging in El Salvador. I will say to the first why. The war came to El Salvador because the alternative for social change and for political change that were non-violent alternatives were closed. I have been in politics since I was a young person, something like 15 years old, doing politics all my life. And my story, let me tell you a little bit about that, because it's an expression of what's going on in El Salvador. We started to organize cooperative of peasants in the area in which I was living, because I am a Catholic. You know, I was working with the church, with the priest in my parish. And we started to organize cooperatives, just this sort of credit cooperative for the peasant. and the National Guard, that is the rural police in my country, saw that that was communism. And they started to persecute us and the peasant. And we were so naive at that time that we went to the national commander of the guard in the main town to explain to him that we were not communists, that we were Catholic, doing our duty as a Catholic, and that duty was the best way to stop communism in the country, you know, because we were doing the right thing. But this man didn't understand and continued to hit us. And I started to learn politics at that moment. That's why I always say my first teacher of politics was the National Guard of my country, because they told me that there was not enough to try to be good with the people and to organize cooperative, that there was another dimension, the political dimension, power dimension, that was interfering and stopping that. When I grew up, after the university, I entered the Christian Democratic Party. I participated in elections, many elections, doing campaigning. And we got from election only repression and fraud. I have been in jail, and once I was a disappeared person, precisely because participating in election. After an election, they took me, and I was disappeared for some days, you know, thanks to many people here in this country and in other countries that put the pressure on the government that they recognized that I was a prisoner. But the only thing that we got from an election was that sort of thing. We tried mass demonstration on the street, and the response to mass demonstration was to shoot at the demonstration. Therefore, we saw in the country all the avenues for a peaceful change started to close. In the end, we came even to make an alliance with the young officer, with the military in El Salvador, to try to avoid a civil war in the country and to make change. And didn't work as well. I was Minister of the Presidency, that is more or less the Chief of Staff of the White House here in the United States, in the first junta in El Salvador, in an alliance with the military. Didn't work at all. Because, again, the structure of power stopped any possibility of reform, any possibility of democratization. And that's why there is a war in El Salvador right now. But this war is being prolonged, and is prolonged not only because injustice and lack of liberties still are a problem in El Salvador, but because another element that I want to talk a little bit about now, and is the U.S. policy in El Salvador. I think that the main factor for the prolongation of the conflict in El Salvador has been the policy of the U.S. administration in our country. Because they have tried to implement in El Salvador a scheme, a project that is called low-intensity conflict project. That is a type of war that is not only a military war, it's a political, a social, and economic war. You know, as Wagelstein, one of the main theoreticians of low-intensity conflict, defined it. And by the way, Wagelstein was head of the, for some time, head of the Mill Group in El Salvador. You know, well, he defined low-intensity conflict as the total war at the grassroots level. And I think it's a very good definition. Total, in the sense that it encompasses economic, social, political, and military matters. And at the grassroots level, because it's directly to the people at the level of the base. And this is the scheme that the United States has been trying to implement in El Salvador. They have been doing for the last 5 years, I will say, seriously. They have been spending a lot of money there, more than $2 million per day in a country like El Salvador that is so tiny. It's a lot of money. And this is only official aid, not other form of aid that as well goes there, you see. And after 5 years, what we got in El Salvador at this moment? What we got in El Salvador is a situation of crisis. The war. The idea of low-intensity conflict is to try to isolate the rebel forces, I mean the Fmln, the Farabundo Martí National Liberation Front, that is the guerrilla in El Salvador. Then low-intensity conflict tried to isolate them. But if you look at a map of military operation by the Fmln in El Salvador now, and let's say 5 years ago, you will see a big difference. A lot of places in which in 1983 there was no military activity by the Fmln, now there is military activity of the Fmln. the whole western part of the country, for instance, the southern part of Cuscatlán, the northern part of La Paz Provincia, the whole province of Cabañas. All are places in which there was not military activity, and now there is constant military activity by the Fmln. Therefore, the guerrilla forces are not isolated. On the contrary, are more spread all around the country and operating in more places around the country. At the political level, the idea of this counterinsurgency project, low-intensity conflict, is to create a legitimate government, a government that will have legitimacy. And that's why they choose the Christian Democratic Party. They choose Napoleon Duarte, because he was a leader in the country that represented a lot, has represented a lot in El Salvador, Napoleon Duarte and the Christian Democrat. But look what happened to the Christian Democrat right now, after 5 years in the government. Completely divided. The party split completely. Now there are 2 Christian Democratic parties. The party lost the last elections to the right, to the extreme right. Never in El Salvador the extreme right had won an elections formally, more or less formally good election. Never they had won that. But they did it. Because the Christian Democrats were so bad in the government that the people started to punish them with the vote and gave the vote to the extreme right party, Arena Party, you see. Divided, full of corruption, a lot of corruption in the government. That means the Christian Democrat, the political instrument, became the first victim of this project. And at the social level, the idea of low-intensity conflict strategy is to create an organized social base for the regime, what they have achieved in El Salvador. That the social base that they started to develop in 1984, that was called UPD in El Salvador, split completely, and many of these organizations went completely into the opposition. And now, the organized social movement is the opposition to the government. Therefore, we have a crisis in El Salvador now. And basically, it's the crisis of a project that the US has been implementing, putting a lot of money in it, but it's not working, it's not producing result. That's why, with that I want to finish. In El Salvador, we are trying to develop a political alternative. We came back to El Salvador in November last year and started to set up our own political parties and develop a coalition of political parties that is called the Democratic Convergency, Convergencia Democrática in Spanish. It's an alliance of 3 political parties that we have presented a common program to the people. We have been working all those 10 months in the country trying to develop our organization under difficult circumstances, but getting some result. And we have decided that we are going to contest the presidential election that is going to be held next year in March in El Salvador. And our idea of contesting an election is to go to the people directly and to present to the people an alternative of a political solution to the conflict. Because it seems to us that in El Salvador, it doesn't make any sense at all to start to talk about economic recovery of the economy that we need, to start to talk of a sensible social policy in health, education, literacy, and so on that we needed. But it doesn't make any sense to talk about those things if you continue with the war. For a very simple reason. The government is not going to have the resources for those policies. When you spend practically, as the government is doing now, more than half the national budget directly or indirectly in the war, where is going to be the money for hospitals? Where is going to be the money for the literacy campaign that we need in the country? Where is going to be the money for medicines? No, there is no money. Therefore, we say the necessary condition for change in El Salvador now is to stop the war. And the way to stop the war is to develop a political settlement of that war. And then our fundamental idea in this campaign is to go to the people and present to the people a proposal for a political solution and try to rally enough support among the people in favor of an alternative of a political settlement of the conflict in El Salvador. Because for us, it is not enough that the government and the guerrilla, the government and the FDR, Fmln, sit down together and try to develop a negotiation. They are going to fail unless there is a social base in the country that is pushing forward this idea of a political settlement. Our task is to create that social base. Our task, in the end, is to bring some hope to the Salvadorian people who has been struggling for so many years, and I think deserve that hope.
The question has several parts. One is, beyond the political settlement which you envision, are there not economic problems which are very endemic? Is not your population too large for the size of your country? Would this not require some kind of Central American spirit of cooperation economically?
Well, in regard to the question of population, in theory it's not too large, in theory, because we have a density lower than Holland, and Holland is able to feed its own population. But in practice, I agree, we have a problem of population because our level of development. Therefore, the democratic convergence considers that a population policy is necessary in El Salvador, no doubt about that. The problem is that we cannot make the mistake to believe that if we curtail the rate of birth in El Salvador, we are solving the problem of the country. No, we are not solving any problem. Curtailing the rate of birth in El Salvador will help to the other solution that we have to make. Yeah? That's in regard to the question of population. The other question that you put was the question about Central America, economic integration. In the democratic convergence, our point of departure is as follows. El Salvador, from an economic point of view, is unviable. It's too small. You need development. You need certain economies of scale. And if you are thinking only in terms of a 5 million market, my goodness, you are going to have always very, very small industries, and sometimes you are not going to be able to put an industry because there is no market for that. The population is too small. Therefore, historically and economically, the alternative for us is Central America. That means to achieve the unity of the Central American countries. That's why we support very clearly the creation of the Central American Parliament, because it seems to us it's a step forward, although it's not going to have too much decision at all, but it's a step forward. We support the recreation of the Central American market, and we support quite clearly the Esquipulas II agreement, because all are those measures that are going to putting together us in Central America, and we need to be together.
The question is, how hard do you expect the American government to work for political accommodation?
Well, I am afraid I have to say that up to now, the U.S. policy toward El Salvador has been, if not the main, at least one of the most grave obstacles for political solution in our country. Insofar as the United States policy is to continue with this strategy of low-intensity conflict, there is no room for political settlement on their part. Because the idea is to isolate, not to try to integrate the different Salvadorian forces into a workable Salvadorian solution. That's why for us it's so important that a change in the U.S. policy toward El Salvador could take place. It seems to me that the U.S. administration, or the new U.S. administration, has to realize one thing, a paradox. The 8 years of Reagan has been the years in which the U.S. administration has put more money and more resources in the whole of Latin America. No other Democratic or Republican administration has put too much money and resources in Latin America. But no other American administration, being that Republican or Democrat, has ended up this period with so many problems and negative reaction on the part of Latin America. And that paradox is telling you something. The relationship between the United States and Latin America are wrong. Something is wrong there. They have to change. And I hope that this possibility that the new administration is going to come will allow the possibility to have a new look at the situation in Central America, to have a look at the situation of Nicaragua and the whole mess of the Contra, the situation in El Salvador, and how the U.S. policy is deteriorating day by day there, and try to make a new start.
Would your political settlement that you envision contemplate a change in the role of the Army or the nature of the Army?
Yes, a political settlement has to make a change in the situation of the Army. Just to give you a few dates. In the 70s, the Salvadorian Army has 13,000 men. Now the Army has more than 54,000 men. I mean, it has grown 4 times. The officer corps has grown 3 times in the last 8 years. The Army used to get something like 5%, 7% of the national budget. Now is getting only the Ministry of Defense is getting only somewhere around 27 to 30% of the national budget. I mean, the country cannot live with such a big army. First things, a political settlement means in El Salvador a clear reduction of the number of soldiers and officers in the Salvadorian army. Second, a political settlement means that the attitude of the army, in the sense that is the army now the institution that is in top of everything, even the President of the Republic, the institution that take the decisions in the country, that situation has to change. And the military power has to be under the control of this real control of the civilian power. I mean, we have to reverse that. And this is something that has to achieve in El Salvador, otherwise we are not going to have democracy. Otherwise, the things that are happening now in El Salvador will continue. For instance, a few days ago, some soldiers go to a town, a small town, take 10 pesos and kill all of them. There is a scandal, and now the army say that the guerrilleros did it. And everybody knows, and all the witnesses are saying, look, was the soldiers. The soldiers took them under the orders of a major of the army and so on, and the army is not prosecuting nobody. And probably nobody is going to be prosecuted in El Salvador because the Salvadorian army is on top of everything now. And this has to be changed, you see. This is the sort of thing that we will have to change in El Salvador with a political settlement, and I think are badly needed in our country.
The question has several facets. One is to what extent is the solution you propose close to the solution which has been achieved in Nicaragua? And if that is the solution which you propose, how would you comment upon the extent of the Soviet Union's involvement in Nicaragua, and how would you comment upon the size of the Nicaraguan army and what is asserted to be political repression, especially toward churches in Nicaragua?
Well, I think that I am not going to go into discussing the situation of Nicaragua in the first place because I am a Salvadorian and I am interested in talking about El Salvador. That's obvious. Sorry about that. Could be other opportunities to talk about Nicaragua. I will be very pleased. But this opportunity with you here, I will take it for El Salvador. But your point, I think, is very important because could help us to sort of discuss situation for El Salvador. And I will take it in this way. Maybe that will please a little bit you. I will take it in the sense that what we are proposing in El Salvador is not the solution of Nicaragua. Yeah? And I think this is my point I want to answer. Because what happened in Nicaragua is that the army of Nicaragua, that was called National Guard, collapsed. The army collapsed, and then these Sandinistas took over the whole of the power in that country. Yeah? What we are proposing in El Salvador is not that kind of thing. What we are proposing is a political settlement of the conflict. That means, by principle, that the army is not going to collapse or is not going to be destroyed as an army because this is not a political settlement. Therefore, it's a difference what we are proposing in terms of alternative for El Salvador. And therefore, we cannot equate completely what is going on and what happened in Nicaragua with what could happen in El Salvador. Besides that, let me tell you that although with Nicaragua, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, we share a lot of problems, a lot of characteristics, there are clear differences between the countries. For instance, let me tell you something. One, in Nicaragua, one of the problems that the Sandinistas have found is that for developing a pluralistic society, or a pluralistic society, political society, doesn't develop by law, develop if there are enough forces, political forces, to develop a pluralist society. Because in the end, democracy and pluralism is a correlation between different forces. If you have only one force, another force, well, there can be democracy or pluralism, you see. And one of the problems of Nicaragua is precisely that the dictatorship of Somoza never allowed the political party system develop in Nicaragua. And then when the Sandinistas took over, they found themselves with a group of political parties in the opposition that are practically unnamed political parties. In reality, they are not. And I know them very well. Because some of them, for instance, the Social Christian, have been Christian Democrats. I know the leaders and so on. And now they are for something like the 7th division of the party. Very, very small structured party because the dictatorship never allowed them. In El Salvador, you got a difference. In El Salvador, even with military government and a structure of political parties that has developed in the country. And the Christian Democrat, we could say whatever we want of the Christian Democrat, but they are a party. And the right, Arena, is a party, an organized party. Therefore, the possibilities in El Salvador for developing a pluralistic political game are much bigger than in other countries. Let's say, for instance, Nicaragua. This is the kind of thing that we have to take into account when looking at a concrete situation. The situation of the church is completely different as well between the two countries. You have to remember in El Salvador you have Monsignor Romero. That Monsignor Romero came to represent the sort of the consciousness of the people in El Salvador. And for all the Christians, not only Catholic, for all the Christians, become a sort of a permanent and constant inspiration to continue trying to change the situation. That didn't happen in Nicaragua. And in that sense, the churches, even the churches, take his own blend of national setup, you see. In that sense, then, what I will say, that I will prefer, as you could understand me, not to discuss the question of Nicaragua in detail, but to try to see how we have differences and similarities as well.
Would you comment further on, one, the extent of your military connection, the opposition's military connection to Nicaragua? The assertion of 95% support was made. And would you comment about your vision of long-term political change in Central America?
Well, I think that you have brought a very important point. And it's a point that I would like to address because it refers to El Salvador. This question that the arms are coming from Nicaragua. Yeah? You say that 95% of the ammunition comes from Nicaragua. First, I will direct you to read the testimony in Congress by the U.S. advisors in El Salvador saying, or what they say about how many arms and ammunition are coming from Nicaragua. What they say, you can see it, that they have been reduced to a trickle. I suppose this is an expression in English that means almost nothing. Yeah? You can read it in the congressional record by colonels of the U.S. Army saying that on their oath. Right. But let's go to the practical and specific situation of the area. It is a pity that we don't have a map. But try to imagine the geographical situation there. Nicaragua doesn't have a common frontier with El Salvador, first point. Therefore, any shipment or any transfer of arms or ammunition by land has to come through Honduras because there is no common frontier between Nicaragua and El Salvador. Yeah? First problem. Therefore, if there is, it comes through Honduras. But you can say, oh, look, there are another two alternatives, by air or by sea. By air, the problem is that the Salvadorian Air Force could be in the frontier in 15 minutes because El Salvador is too small. Therefore, any plane that enters Salvadorian airspace in 15 minutes could be intercepted and shot down. Nobody's going to start to send planes with arms to El Salvador, especially from Nicaragua. Then is left the last possibility by sea. Okay, but let's go to the ground. Nicaragua and El Salvador are close by sea. I separated by the Gulf of Fonseca. What is the situation there? First, in the mouth of the Gulf of Fonseca, there is an island, Meanguera, that is occupied by the United States. And the U.S. Navy has military facilities there for surveillance and interception. Secondly, the United States normally, the U.S. Navy normally has a frigate patrolling those waters with a lot of equipment for surveillance. Thirdly, the Salvadorian Navy, that is not very big but has boats, patrol boats, is completely concentrated in that area. Now, if this is the situation, and this is factical situation, can you explain me how the Fmln people could go and start to pass arms by sea with surveillance all around the place? And again, I will quote an American colonel in testimony to one of the U.S. groups, U.S. Congress group, Foreign Affairs. He said that we have such a capacity of surveillance in that area that if a Salvadorian peace, we can know it. Sorry about that, but it's a quotation from that. Therefore, the whole thing about this shipment of arms from Nicaragua to El Salvador, please, sorry, is just propaganda from the Reagan administration.
If there were a political settlement, what fraction of American aid now given for military purposes do you think would be used for other purposes? And comment upon the impact of that change.
Well, I think that right now, the last study that was made by one of the caucus at the U.S. Congress about the use of American aid in El Salvador give more or less the basic figures. 30% of the aid is directly military aid. 15% of the aid is aid for development, and the rest, 55%, is indirect military aid. Those are the figures from the U.S. Congress for the aid to El Salvador. That means it's overwhelmingly related or directed to the military effort in El Salvador. If that change, oh my goodness, it seems to me it could make a very important impact in our society. My first question will be El Salvador capable to digest such amount of money? That will be my first question, because will be too much. And you know that you have to take into account, if you put too much money in a country, and that country has no capacity to digest in terms of institutions, programs, and so on, the only thing that you are producing is corruption in that country. It's sad, but with good intention, you produce bad result. Therefore, first thing, could we digest that? But anyway, if we can say, okay, not the first year too much, but let's put it in a program for 7-8 years of reconstruction of the country. We need to reconstruct buildings, schools, hospitals, bridges, and a lot of things. And therefore, if we use that money for reconstruction, we are going to give work to our people. And now we have in El Salvador, don't believe it, you maybe don't believe it, but it's true, 75% unemployment in the country, between open unemployment and sub-employment, 75%, you see? Therefore, there is a lot of people that need work in El Salvador, and we can give work to them through those sort of programs. Of course, I think it's going to have a big impact, could have a big impact in El Salvador, but for playing that impact, we need peace in the country. Otherwise, it's impossible.
The question, I believe, is, given the fact that you have understated, it's alleged, the guerrilla problem, and given the fact that you have understated the involvement of Nicaragua in that movement, and given the fact, alleged fact, that you've understated the difficulties that Nicaragua poses in the area, how does one know that you indeed would not be in favor of a similar regime in El Salvador?
Right. Sometimes for me it's difficult to understand these things. That if you say that you have been seeing cayucos is very small boat, in the Gulf of Fonseca going from and to Nicaragua, I have seen them as well. There has been a lot of traffic of cayucos between the two countries. You are implying that those cayucos are passing arms and ammunition. Yeah? Yeah, you are stating that. Well, then I don't understand anything. You are a military person. You are a person knowing that arms are flowing, and you don't stop that. Come on. What are you doing then in El Salvador?
That was not our mandate, sir. That was the mandate of the Salvadoran government. Because the U.S. government...
Try to put then a military in El Salvador to do their own job.
United States to have more than 55
But going into the...
Americans in your country, while
But-
there's 35,000 Cubans in Nicaragua.
Yes, but going back to the point of your question, look, again, I don't know, if you try to say 35,000 Cubans in Nicaragua, probably there are not so many. There are Cubans in Nicaragua. I think that we have to try to see more objective the situation in our countries, you see, more objective. And in that sense, if in El Salvador we are able to achieve a political settlement of the conflict, then that is going to be a very important contribution for achieving peace in the whole of Central America. In the same way that if the Nicaraguans are able to solve the problem that now they have, the Contra, the Sandinistas, and achieve a lasting agreement in Nicaragua, political agreement is going to be a contribution for pushing forward a political settlement in El Salvador. This is what we are interested in. We are not interested in rhetoric about the Marxist regimes of Nicaragua. We are not interested, because it's rhetoric. If you go to that country and 60% of production is in the hands of the private sector, it's very difficult to say that this is a Marxist regime. My goodness. The problem is that it's not a sort of capitalistic reactionary government. No, they are revolutionary. This is something I am not going to deny. But I will try to go to a more objective look at what that means, revolutionary in Nicaragua, what they are doing, what are the mistakes that they are doing, what are the good things that they are doing, and try to learn for the future of my country. In that sense, I say I am not interested in rhetoric. I am interested in learning from experience, the experience of the Nicaraguan, the experience of the American people as well. In that sense, try to better our society. And for us, the fundamental thing is to try to reach political agreements in Central America.
Would you comment on your view of amnesty within any political settlement which derives?
Well, the problem is that the people who are abroad do not need any amnesty in El Salvador. No, they don't need. Because in El Salvador, by constitution, it's forbidden that the government expels somebody from the country. It's a different situation from South America, you see. In El Salvador, it's forbidden to the government by the constitution to expel somebody from the country. Therefore, all the people who are outside are because they want to be outside. They could go back to the country without any need of an amnesty. Besides that, the question of the amnesty is raised because the problem of human rights violations in the country. But already last year, the government gave a complete amnesty, and therefore this is something that cannot be changed. America's Watch Committee, another international body like Amnesty International, criticized very strongly the Salvadorian government because they granted amnesty to the death squads, the torturer, and so on and so forth. But this is already done. And you cannot go with amnesty 10 years or 5 years after saying, look, that amnesty was not good. Therefore, all the people has to be tried now. This is the sort of thing that you cannot do it, you see. And this is the situation there.
This is for a Nicaraguan, I mean, a El Salvadorian president.
Yes, if he were elected
Right.
president, where would he begin to solve the problems? That's all I'm asking.
Prescribe, if you would, the first 100 days of a newly elected El Salvadorian president taking over in June of 1989.
God help me. Besides praying a lot. No, I think that your question was directed to the question of political solution. Look, the Democratic Convergence is presenting a project, a proposal for a political solution in 3 phases that we consider that could be achieved in a period between 9 and 12 months. The first step that will be what immediately we have to start is what we call compliance with Esquipulas II. The idea is that Esquipulas II has been signed by the 5 Central American presidents, but they have not fulfilled Esquipulas II. Therefore, we say that for starting a process of political solution, preparing the ground for a negotiation, we need first to start with Esquipulas II. And there we propose a set of measures. One is the declaration of neutrality, military neutrality in the conflict in Central America. That means we are not going to destabilize any other country in Central America, neutrality. Secondly, the measure about human rights, the creation of a sort of Procuraduría General de Derechos Humanos is in Spanish. In English will be a sort of attorney, special attorney general for human rights. That means will be an office, that not a commission, an office that will deal with investigating human rights violations and bringing to trial whoever is committing those violations. That means to develop that area. A third measure that will be preparatory is the question of the foreign military advisors. Ask foreign military advisors to get out of the country, as Esquipula said. The other thing is to start the process of de-escalation of the armed conflict, proposing certain measures that are not going to stop the war, but at least are going to reduce the level of violence. And basically, we propose 4 measures. Stopping economic sabotage, any form of economic sabotage. Stopping the use of mines. Stopping the use of the Air Force for bombardment and so on. And stopping the use of the long-range artillery. Because those 4 things are the ones who cause more problem for the civilian population. And therefore, that agreement between the government and the Fmln could reduce the level of the war and create better conditions. And the other point that we will propose in this preliminary step is the question of the Moratorium of Arms. For a period of time, 6 months moratorium of arms. That means no arms enter the country once the negotiation is started. Because the problem is that sometimes you go for a ceasefire, for the negotiation, but at the same time you keep hoarding arms, and at a certain moment you feel very strong, break the ceasefire, and ruin everything. Then, as a precautory measure, as well, we will say suspension of any entrance of arms to the country with international supervision of that, you see. Well, that will be the measure that I will try, if the Democratic Convergence win the election, to implement in the first 100 days.
Assuming that the policy of the United States does not change after the upcoming election and the military aid continues, what is your prognosis?
I think that my prognosis is that certain gains that already have been achieved in these 8 years probably are going to deteriorate. Basically, political spaces. Now there are political spaces in El Salvador. For instance, I, that am in the opposition, go to television and spoke in television, and this is a political space, on radio as well, I think that they are going to suffer. Secondly, it seems to me that polarization in the country will continue and making more difficult for the future any political settlement. Thirdly, the power of the military as the dominant, real dominant power in the country will as well continue to increase, you see. And in that sense, those are results that seems to me negative for the development of the country. And probably with that sort of policy will be a boost, a push for the Arena Party as well in the presidential election in El Salvador that is going to be held in March.
How would you make land reform work?
Well, I think that is going to be a major issue during the campaign. Now, because now in El Salvador the question is privatization versus continue with the reform. And that's deal with the agrarian reform. We consider that, first, the agrarian reform, in terms of productivity, the cooperatives that have been planting beans, maize, and so on, present levels of productivity higher than the national average. Those are the facts. The problem of the agrarian reform is not really productivity. The problem is, one, the number of people that have been incorporated in those areas, and there are certain cooperatives with such a few members that they are not using the whole land. First problem. But the second problem is the agrarian debt. The cooperatives are at the level of production successful, but at the financial level are a disaster. And the disaster of the agrarian reform in El Salvador is at the financial level because the agrarian debt, because the financial policies in the end. Therefore, we say that first, what we have to say is democratization of the agrarian reform. I mean, to pass more decisions to the peasants, to have confidence in the peasants, and not too much in the government. It's not the government the one who has to continue to decide for the peasant. Democratization. Secondly, to solve the problem of the agrarian debt. Has to be solved. Thirdly, I think that we have to increase the number of people into the agrarian reform sectors, introducing more people into the cooperatives. And finally, we have to try to develop as much as possible what is called in El Salvador the second phase of the agrarian reform that has been not done because the right in the Constitution put a ceiling to the number of hectares that a person could own, and therefore make it impossible to do the second phase of the agrarian reform. But we could advance something there. We already have seen the data, and it's possible to advance a little bit there. But basically, those are the measures that we are proposing.
Is there a contradiction between a Marxist government and a Catholic society?
Yeah. Well, what I was trying to reproduce is my dialogue with the commander when I was 15 years old or something like that. Let me be frank, I am not a communist, not because I am a Catholic. I am not a communist because I don't believe in the ideas that they believe. They have the right to have their own ideas, but I don't believe in those ideas, therefore I am not a communist. Not because I am a Catholic, because I know Catholics that they say that they are communists at the same time. Well, it's a problem of consciousness of everybody. Yeah? But to put the whole thing very clear. But look, what we have to see is that political alliances are made at the political level and not necessarily at the ideological level. And sometimes you need political alliance with different forces. If this is a necessity for the country, you have to do it. In fact, in El Salvador, Mr. Duarte was the candidate in 1972 of a coalition of the Christian Democrat, the MNR, that is the party affiliated to the Socialist International, and the UDN, that everybody knows in El Salvador that the UDN is the legal expression of the Communist Party. And let's be frank. And there was no problem at all. Mr. Duarte was the candidate. I was a Christian Democrat at that time, and we approved, I was in the leadership, we approved the alliance. Why? Because it was necessary to do so politically. And that doesn't mean that we become the Christian Democrat, we become communists, or the communists become Christian Democrat. No way. We continue with our own ideas and our own goals, you see. But in that moment, it was necessary to do. And this is the way we see it in El Salvador, you see. That El Salvadorian people has been able to advance when it's possible to mount these sort of very broad coalitions of the people. That was our experience in toppling Martinez dictatorship in 1944. That was our experience in toppling the government of Colonel Lemus in 1989. That was our experience of the National Union of Opposition at the beginning of the 70s. That was our experience in 1979 with the National Forum, Popular Forum. I mean, this is the way the Salvadorian people do things. I am not prescribing it for the American people, but please understand, if this is our historical mode of operating, we are going to continue because it's good for us.
Well, we're delighted that you were able to share with us this afternoon your deep experience and your insights and your views of the situation in El Salvador. And we certainly share with you the aspiration that a amicable settlement can be found, which does indeed eventually allow the El Salvadoran people to pursue their quest for the happiest existence possible. You've squeezed us into a very, very busy schedule while you're here in the United States. We appreciate that very much. Thank you again.